Welcome to What's Your Point with Colin Barnes and Graham Mills. In this series of podcasts, we will use a famous statement or quote from the world of sport to start our conversation and bring light to a topic. Our goal is to dispel myths and make the truth stick. Come join us in the discussion. We are continuing on this week in our discussion about talent, predictors of talent, and the bias we have when predicting. The quote comes from one of England's legendary goal scorers, Gary Lineker. He said, "Football is a simple game. 22 men chase a ball for 90 minutes, and at the end, the Germans win." Hey, Graham.
How you doing?
Doing well. All right. This week, this is going to be an interesting one with Gary Lineker's infamous and famous statement about the Germans. To give some clarity, he has updated the "football is simple" in which the Germans win statement, and the funniest part is it evolved during the last World Cup, and after the first match, he updated and said, "Football is a simple game. 22 men chase the ball for 82 minutes. The Germans get a player sent off. So 21 men chase the ball for 13 minutes. And at the end, the Germans somehow effing win." So it's the comedy that he goes with. And then, of course, afterwards, we have the Germans don't qualify. Obviously, them and the Spanish didn't have the best of World Cups that they normally do, and he updated it again at the end on the 27th of June. "Football is a simple game. 22 men chase a ball for 90 minutes, and at the end, the Germans no longer always win." Previous version is confined to history. So I love this comment, because it goes into the cultural belief. It goes into the mindset of the English, and obviously, as you for many of our listeners, they may be too young to have gone further back, to have been around for the '90 World Cup. I remember that one. As a 10-year-old, I was more English than I was American, simply because the Americans hadn't come in to notoriety. We didn't even, really. Yes, we qualified. That was our first time to qualify for a World Cup, but it was more of a joke than anything. So we were, I was wearing my England kit. It wasn't a flashy World Cup, but definitely getting into the semifinals was great. And for Lineker not to advance to the finals because the Germans, and that kind of laid the foundation. I think they lost in 96 as well, with the penalty shootout again, with unfortunately our Southgate's, your twin, missing that time. But there is a belief in other nations. So there's this perception, and when we talk about talent, when we talk about how we perceive others, it's always in relation to ourselves compared to other nations. So it is a case of how do we see ourselves with others, and clearly the Germans are thought of in Gary's statement here, that they are better than us internationally. They produce better talent, and they know how to win at the international stage. Am I wrong in stating that's the psyche of the typical English fan and developer of talent?
I think, just talking from my own perspective, I sort of grew up in the 90s watching football, so there was some sort of mystique around Germany. We saw a lot of Italian football, so there was Football Italia on Channel 4, so Gascoigne going over there and Platt playing there, and some of the talent that was playing in Italy at the time. It's probably the number one country to play in, a bit like the Premier League is now. It had more money, more commercial presence, and a lot of the best players in the world would head to Italy to play their football.
Maradona as well.
Yeah, and it was on Channel 4 in England. So I used to love watching Italian football. But every time a European Championship or a World Cup came around, Germany would be there, and inevitably England would play Germany, and they would lose. Often would be the case, and Germany just had a way of getting to semi-finals and being successful. So back then we didn't have the TV coverage that we have now, so probably they were only our glimpses of German football back then. So every 2 years when a major tournament came around, you'd get to see Germany play, and they were just a very successful nation. And there was probably a bit of a mystique, and I probably would share Gary Lineker's sort of viewpoint that Germany were the team that often had the success, often at the expense of England. And I guess there's been a stigma, or that's probably built over the years. You think of '96, so home nation.
It's coming home.
It's coming home. The music, the crowd at Wembley, everything seemed like England were going to be successful, and then along came Germany again, and we go out on penalties. So I think there's probably that sort of relationship where we as English fans look at Germany and perhaps are a bit envious of the success they've had, and look at now the players that are producing, and England are now producing players, but we haven't yet got the success. We talk about the golden generation and the Beckhams and Lampards and Gerrards, but we've never really pushed it over the line and led to success, whereas Germany have got a way of doing that.
And if we look at it from a statistical standpoint, I mean, Greece has won more championships than England has in the last few. Considering that the when we talk about success, obviously the on the men's side, I mean, obviously the Americans have only won within their gold cups, within a continent that consists of entirely three countries, three major countries, and then a bunch of little islands. But this perception of how others take things go in different ways. So obviously, me being the American amongst the Brits, and the Brad Bobley effect from a few years ago with Swansea. Now we've got Ted Lasso, and so recently in the news we hear these comments coming from Jesse Marsch and Frank Lampard, and it was really interesting. So for those of you who don't even know, we've got Jesse Marsch, an American, easily our best American manager within the European landscape, and he's doing well with Red Bull, and so he makes the comment. So the story goes, they play against each other, Chelsea and Leipzig. Is it Leipzig? No, they don't play. Who does he manage? I can't remember who. I can't remember which one of the Red Bulls. There's so many Red Bulls teams. Well, they play, and he sees Christian Pulisic, the American, very talented American, I could see right away that Frank Lampard's idea of Christian Pulisic was shaped a lot by the fact that he was an American, and not that his football education came from what was happening in Germany. Since then, I think Lampard has learned that Pulisic is a lot better than he gave him credit for. And so this idea that Lampard is now prejudiced against the Americans is kind of the opposite of the Lineker comment against the Germans. And so we see it in this landscape that there are perceptions from other countries. There's this bias, and so Lampard had to go on the defensive. And so remember, Lampard, after his career with Chelsea, wasn't able to sign with them. So then he goes over and plays with New York City, and then comes back to Man City as the parent club for a little bit. And he goes, I played in America for 18 months, and I would never underestimate the desire American soccer players have to learn and improve and take information, understand the technical side. And as an American, I hear the slight in that. It's subtle, but the word desire. And so there's this perception of a lower class, footballing country, like the Americans, that their technical ability isn't good enough, their tactical ability, but you know what? They do have some athletes and they have really good work ethic. And it almost, Lampard is trying to defend himself, saying, oh, no, I really thought he was a very good player. I've played in America. I understand the culture. And yet he's only feeding into what Jesse has said, that actually you don't rate him as a player. You only think he's a hard worker. And this is seen, in a variety of cases, whatever the country may be. And so we have these perceptions, and it is interesting to see what those perceptions come from different places. So what would your perception of an American player be?
Just that I would probably say, in my experience of playing against maybe American sort of youth players, tend to be more physically mature, athletic players. I coached in America for a summer back in 2003, and again, the attitude, application, very sort of teachable, coachable players. Back then, the women's football was, I coached girls and boys football in the States, and the women's football, they were exceptional, compared to what I was used to in England from the female game. Technically very, very good. I'd probably say back then, and obviously the football landscape has changed a lot since 2003, but I'd probably say that my experience was more towards that athleticism. So American players were very athletic, powerful, strong, technically okay, but there was no one that jumped out at me as being technically excellent from the boys' game. The women's game, yeah, certainly there was a lot of technically good players, but I think that probably comes down to a lot of social and cultural influences. Boys in America have got such a choice of sports that they can play, so there's probably lots of influence on that. But whether I agree strongly with Lampard's statement, I don't know, but I'd probably say that it was similar in my experiences, that it was athleticism before technique. But like I say, now you see players coming through from the States that's no longer the case. And in the 17 years that have passed, I'm sure a lot of good work has gone in and changed the development of players that I would have seen when I was there.
Yeah, and it's a case that we're aware that obviously there are exceptions to the rules. So maybe Pulisic is the exception, and there are other players that can come through, and you can say that about every country. But it's good that we have interest from people that have spoken out in recent weeks with us. That, okay, so what has England, so if we come back to this English comment, how does England rate to other countries, and whether it's a positive or a negative, whether these things are happening. We do need to be mindful of what other countries are doing to develop players and how that happens. And one of the interesting reads, so if you haven't been a part of it or don't know about it, Youth Football and Development, Lessons from the World's Best Academies, Nesty and Sully, 2014. It may not be the most academic read, but it is a good read to find out. And so they kind of go into kind of the structures of what we've already been talking about. We've got, in 1997, as you talked about a few weeks ago, we've got the Howard Wilkinson Charter for Quality, and based off of that, these Germans, the robots that know how to produce winners, they see it. And so Matthias Sommer, great player back in his day, they look and come and observe what Howard Wilkinson's doing and going, okay, well, we're not winning. We didn't win the 98 World Cup. We need to find out what's going on. And so they actually created this categorical system within their academy and development back in 2002. And obviously what we know with the EPPP coming in, obviously a decade later, the English go, oh, wow, they're doing that. Okay, so we need to create our own categorical system to be able to help develop. And I know you've kind of gone and done your own observations and studies within Europe. So how do the other nations that you've been to, how the comment from last week was about Portugal. How does the Portuguese, and we didn't have because we don't have any direct knowledge, but I know you have knowledge within these other nations. So what is it that the other nations are doing in their development?
So I think every nation has its own model. So I think probably, we talk about England having created the game, and I think sometimes with success, and we've talked about this before on some of our podcasts, that with success comes complacency at times, and sometimes it takes difficult moments or crisis for good things to happen. And that was certainly the case with Germany, and they looked at what England was doing and then have taken that model. So I think every nation has its own spin on this and its way of doing it. When I went to Spain, I spent some time at Bilbao, and talking to their coaches, they were very against the notion of an EPPP type system where someone from outside of your club was going to tell you what you needed to be doing, what facilities you needed to offer, the time on the pitch, the education system, all those things. They found it very alien to them that someone would come in and tell you what to do in your club. You at your club should know the best interests of your players and what your first team are after, and have the freedom to do it in your way. So Spain don't really have that sort of system. We know Germany have got a similar system to England, with sort of a double pass system, an external audit. I think they use a star rating, so like the Bayerns and Dortmund's, I think it's 3 stars that you get at sort of international level. In Holland they have a 4-stage system, so they look at international academy as being sort of number 1, and at the moment, or certainly until recently, there was 6 clubs, so Ajax, AZ Alkmaar, Feyenoord, PSV, Utrecht and Vitesse Arnhem, and then from that there's national level, then regional and then local. I think from the countries that I've seen, there's probably a lot of commonalities. So you would look at what a Cat 1 academy in England does. You could probably cross-reference a lot of that stuff with what Bayern does, with what Ajax does, for example. But it's more the nuanced difference, that the things that come from their culture that they do. The Ajax way of doing things is 4-3-3. Lots of ex-players come and coach at the academy. There's a real Ajax way to doing things, and I think they're aware that there's pros and cons to that approach, but it's them and that's what they do, and they're going to put their flag in the ground, and that's defines what they do.
And Bournemouth was very similar, the family feel, because they are maybe more isolated because of the geographical location. But there is definitely, when we went last year, there was definitely a feel of, we want to hire ex players, pros, whoever it is, because there is that niche of, this is what we do, this is our identity. Is that
And I think from what I've seen from visits is that the smaller clubs are the ones that happen to be really innovative, because they perhaps don't have the budget, the resource to match what other clubs are doing. They can't go and spend money on players, and so what happens generally, and a bit like football, is that staff tend to get headhunted or poached. So a lot of AZ Alkmaar staff, for example, are now at PSV. So I think it's a case of, it's not necessarily the nation or the system that's producing them. It's the people and the culture and the leadership of that club that really makes the difference. Because there's probably no rocket science to a lot of this stuff. It's just a real belief that this is what we're going to do. This is the path that we believe in, and we're going to keep on innovating and keep on finding ways of improving those marginal gains, those 1%. Those are the differences that I've seen. Like Bilbao are unique because they've got their their own imposed Basque rule, so they'll only play players of Basque origin, but that they make it work and they find a way. And what Bilbao do won't fit what Man City do, so you can't just pick up their model because it's successful and they get players in the first team and go and transport it to another club, because it just won't work. So the context is king in all this. But again, going back to the point, it's usually the people that they employ. The direction is very clear from leadership. The culture runs through everything they do, and their values, and they commit to it, and they're constantly looking at. You look at the success of Ferguson, for example. If we look at a manager, constantly evolving. He knew when to sell a player on. He very rarely made a mistake in that respect. Obviously, Yapstam probably being the biggest one that he sold too early, but he was always looking at what's next. Never got complacent, never rested on his laurels, and was always looking to change and evolve. And I think most of the best youth development systems or clubs do that.
Yeah, if we take the approach that everything's contextual and that every situation is different, it's hard to kind of sort through all this data, all this, all the things that are going on across the world in all these different contexts, and have any, commonalities, and so this week's reading might be that way that we can kind of go, okay, we understand that this country is different than that country, which is different from that country, in all these different contexts. But if we look at things that might be similar, we can extrapolate some way to say, yep, this is a good way to develop, and that kind of leads into this idea about other factors that predict talent. And so one of the readings that we have is the Hancock et al. From 2018, and talking about birthplace bias, and that in previous research, we've got the ability of where someone is born will help predict their elite success. So back in 2006 and earlier, we have these researchers that are looking into a really good idea on population of where you were born. So where were you born?
Southampton.
Okay. How many are here? What's our population in Southampton? Is it 100,000?
It's one of the top 10 biggest, I think, in terms of cities in England.
Okay. Birmingham, Alabama, about 100,000. And so when I talk about or think about my development in terms of an actual footballer or an elite level athlete, Birmingham, Alabama is a small bucket in terms of population size, and in fact, it was a bad place. Of the 50 states in America, it was an awful place to actually try and play out of. It would be this, if I went to the Southwest and went into a low populated area, and so at times, players within these small communities had to eventually make a decision. Do I want to go and play with a team that were in a more populated areas? Because all the best clubs were centered around major cities. So the research, and we'll kind of get to that part later, was that you had to go to big cities, and the conversation we had about gymnasts. So all the best gymnasts in the world, or especially in America, they have to go to one or two cities, wherever the Olympic coaches are going to be. So if we think back to Bella Carolla and all Nadia Comaneci, her coach, he migrated or immigrated into America. He had his gym, club, whatever you want to call it. So no matter where you developed in America, you eventually had to go there, and that's where you developed. Similar pathway goes for most of those players, and we're insinuating that as well, that the EPP's pathway is develop up to, and if we believe that Arsene Wenger is right, then they're going to develop their skills in wherever they are by 14, and then they're going to move into a Cat 1 club, because that's where our elite level talent needs to develop to be able to play against everyone. Well, these research studies, and we start with, Cote and all in 2006, the best chance to develop in all the major sports in North America, so whether it's baseball, ice hockey, football, your population size for those players was best at 50,000 to 100,000, which is counterintuitive. That doesn't make sense. And so it later got confirmed with Baker and all, 2009, that the Olympians had the best chance in different countries. So in the UK, it was only 10,000 to 30,000. So you're going to be able to interpret that. Is that a normal village? Bournemouth must be less than that, right?
Well, in terms of like an urban area, so Southampton, it's all the sort of smaller places around it is 900,000.
900. Okay, so
for
right
the
around
whole urban area.
Wow.
So, I guess if you were to take a small village, like a Hamble or Hedge End or somewhere like that, it might be closer to those sort of numbers, but I don't know.
Yeah. But again, we have to understand, we talk about context all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Context, Olympic athletes.
Yeah.
Typically individual sports. Rarely is, heck, even the football didn't become an Olympic sport for Britons until 2012. So, that didn't really occur. In the U.S., it's 250,000 to 500,000. In Canada, 1 million to 2.5 million population. Germany, 2.5 million to 5 million. That's the sweet spot for Olympic athletes. That's what their findings were. Right. So the context is completely different, which kind of leads to what we've been saying, that all of these things matter. But the interesting part that all of this research comes back to is that these smaller cities, medium-sized cities, actually helps develop elite talent, if you're going to make it at the highest level, more so than the really populated areas like the Londons, the Birminghams. In America, it'd be the Chicagos, the LAs, the Atlantas, New York City, from their findings. And the ways that a smaller city might improve is better access to facilities. So if you're in a smaller city, less people are going to be there. You can go and use whatever facility you need. Early exposure to a variety of sports. So imagine you're at a small university or a small school and there's not many students. Well, you have to play every sport because there's not enough there to play. Competition with older peers, which for me, I don't know about you, but I learned more from playing with older players than I ever did with my own age group. I was able to implement what I'd learned from older players. I don't know if that was your case. Yeah. The other one that I found interesting was the correlation between parents letting their players or their kids go out and play more in a smaller city compared to an urban setting where it's in the middle of a city. Makes perfect sense, and that comes back to the deliberate play, deliberate practice. If parents feel unsafe that children can go out and play freely, then they're going to say, no, you got to come home. No, you can't go do this. Yet, if they don't care, back when we grew up, it was, just let them go and play. Just come back by 7 p.m. That's when dinner time is, and then we'll get going. And so, therefore, kids are playing more in deliberate play, which helps to ultimate development of athleticism. And then there's the big fish, little pond theory, that if you are the big fish in a small pond, that you're going to gain more confidence in your own abilities. People are going to lavish more praise on you, and you're going to be able to handle stressful moments, which is against the idea of the reaching the top of the mountain. So if you're a 15-year-old and you make a national team in the youth setup, then you're going to be able to make it at the end, which goes against the research that you had. So it's always fun to see what people have to say, because they contradict themselves sometimes. But the finding that population density is important is really interesting. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think with Cote's research, so back in 2006, I think it's not as recent as the one that we've recommended for this week. I think probably a couple of flaws with that one is the type of sports that he looked into. So golf, for example, and hockey, ice hockey. So densely populated cities probably aren't going to have the space for a golf course or a purpose-built facility for ice hockey. So you could argue that probably picking those sports doesn't necessarily tell us too much around football, because football in large cities you can have, 5-a-side courts, and it doesn't necessarily have to be an 11-a-side pitch, but somewhere to play. You don't need equipment and facilities to play football. It could just be a local park and jumpers for goalpost type approach. So I think there's definitely some merit to the research, and I'm fascinated by this sweet spot of population that you need to have to get a good level of, because if you are the big fish in a small pond, talent needs talent. So at some point you're going to have to go to a bigger city or to a club to flourish and progress. So if you are the big fish, that may hamper your ability to cope once you do go across and you're just a regular Joe in a team. So I think it's really interesting. And if we look at England, for example, there's been some research into the makeup of England squads over the years and the number of players that have represented England. And when we look at the areas of the country, the southwest, which is generally quite a rural place. Yeah. I think the biggest city in the southwest is Bristol, and then next to that is Plymouth. Plymouth is nowhere near the size of a Liverpool or Manchester, for example, but they've only contributed 3% of England internationals. Whereas you look at other bigger cities, so the northwest provides the highest number of international players for England, so they provide 23% of players, and in there is the Liverpools and the Manchesters. In fact, there's a real sort of north-south divide. So the north provides or has provided 544 players, whereas the south provides 316, and London alone produces more or has contributed more players than the whole of the south, so southeast and the southwest combined. So if we look at English football as an example, it would suggest that the more populated places, the more populated parts of the country provide or produce more players. Obviously in rural places like a Plymouth or a Devon or a Cornwall or somewhere along those lines, there's going to be the benefits that you've talked about, the more access to unstructured play, the ability to go out and play in larger areas, the ability to go and play with older peers, more access to a coach or whatever. There's not as much competition, and they have produced players. So Dan Gosling, Ethan Ampadu, Jack Butland have come from that part of the country, but nowhere near the amount that have come from more densely populated, maybe competitive. And you also get the cultural benefits as well. So living in a multicultural city like London, yes, it is tough and it's difficult, and to really stand out in that sort of environment, you've got to have that competitive edge, and you've got to be strong mentally. But you've also got lots of countries and lots of nationalities that you can learn from. So there's probably South American players, there's probably European players that you can get to watch and play against and with. So your analogy of playing against older players, they're also getting access. Whereas if you live in the middle of nowhere, you're not going to get that benefit. So
I'm with you. I mean, the idea, especially with football, you've got to have 11 players. When you coach, and especially at the youth level, and you feel like you're on an island and you can't bring in, better players, you're almost hamstrung into saying, well, I've only got these players, and there's very few extra players that are going to be recruited into this team. What happens when one player drops off? This idea of competition level. So players develop in two different environments. One, it's the training environment, the day-to-day, whatever team you're playing with and who you get to train with. So sometimes players need to train against their own, but if they're accelerated and they're developing faster maybe than their peers, they need to go and train with older players. So having access to an older team might be really important to their development. Then there's, who are you competing against? Who are you playing against every weekend that's, testing you, challenging you, forcing you to be better in whatever regard. And when you're in a bigger city, it's easier to go and play against, if you're in London and you're, in Croydon with Palace, you can easily go play another club because there's many clubs in that little area. When you're stuck in Plymouth, who's going to want to go and travel there on a Saturday? You're going to have less access to be able to play against great competition, and you're not going to have as many great players to play with day in and day out. So this idea of where you're born definitely affects it. And just as we talked about with the gymnast, eventually players are going to have to go to wherever the best talent is to train with them and have the highest ability to compete against the best quality as well. And ironically, we're hearing that a week after the idea of having this European Super League kind of got leaked out, and the best clubs in England and Europe, and Barca's president goes out, but says, oh yeah, Barca's going to join this Super League, and so the research actually contradicts itself in the population size. It's actually not that great of a indicator. It's actually density size, which comes into this this idea and the more recent research that you talked about. So in 2018, they looked at Hancock and all looked at volleyball players in Portugal, and it was actually the population density that triggers is a better indicator of producing talent. So within the men's development for volleyball players, it was actually the lower density. With the women, it was higher density. So we've got this different idea on the women's side and the men's side. So it's more important for the women to be in a higher density, so a bigger population, or most closely knit population, than it is for the men, which is kind of stark contrast. I went and looked at our women and men's makeup of big city, small city, within the U.S. And so within the roster that went to the World Cup in 2019, there were 5 from kind of a very small city, 5 from a medium city, and then 13 from a big city. So 57% came from a big city, and the majority of that was Philly, a couple from Atlanta, a couple from San Francisco and LA, and then a couple from Colorado. So these kind of bigger cities. On the men's side, now this was taken over what they consider their current roster, which is many are, first or, within 5 or 6 appearances for the national team. It's even worse towards these bigger cities where only 4 came from a small city, 4 came from a medium city, and then 15 came from a big city, and that's over 65%. So it kind of feeds into this idea that you need to have come from a big city, or or access to a big city. So these suburban, as you talked about, the surrounding areas of Southampton. It's really important to, yes, you want to take the best part of being in a small town, but close enough to still have access to the big city to compete against others. That close drive, within the EPPP, we talk about this hour distance for young players, and then the 90 minutes for once they get into the YDP. Is that the same for other clubs or other nations?
Yeah, generally speaking, they do have catchment areas that they stick to. However, again, some clubs have been quite innovative around how they use that. So, for example, PSV have set up, I think, 8 development centres around the suburbs because there's so much competition for players. If they take 10 under-8s at each of those centres, that gives them 80 under-8s players, whereas if they just did it centrally at their academy, it reduces their catchment area, and plus there's a cap on number of players that they can actually have it there. So what they do is they cast their net wider, therefore they can select or identify more players, and then from that, then there's a filtering effect where they can then bring in the best players at perhaps 11s or 12s into the academy environment. So lots of different clubs do it differently. If we look at, I think you mentioned at the start about Germany and how they restructured their pathway. So again, in 2004, they lost to the Czech Republic and were eliminated from that competition. I think it was probably the first time in their history without getting to the knockout stages. So they finished second from bottom with 2 points, and I think those 2 points came from draws against Latvia and Holland. So it was a real eye-opening, worrying moment for Germany in terms of the success that we've talked about at the start. To have a tournament like that was unacceptable by their standards. So that sort of triggered this period of introspection, and they tried to reinvent what they were doing. So one of the things that they did was they set up 390 talent development programs around the country, similar to the PSV model, but on a much larger national scale. And those centres, each of those centres were affiliated or linked to 65 clubs. And they also had link with schools as well, so it was a real national approach that they took to this, and everyone bought into it. Whereas in England, we look at it and everyone wants their piece of the pie, and it's club against country, and no one really wants to work together. Whereas in Germany, they really achieved that, and per year they was able to look at and elevate 20,000 players through the pathway, 22,000 players. They employed coaches and coordinators for these centres, and because of this pathway or this system that they employed, they identified Toni Kroos, who is now one of the most celebrated German players in terms of team successes and also individual honours. But he was from a small place called Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, a tiny little place. But he would never have been identified had they not done that approach. So he was in this rural area. He was no doubt a big fish and massive talent. But unless he had the other talent to really push and strive and compete with in these development centres, he probably would never have made it.
And the Hancock and all for 2018, they're finding, and it's kind of gone with the consensus, the trend is, the best talents, the most substantial talents, don't come from the highest population densities and groups, nor the least. It's somewhere in between, and it tends to be a little bit less than the medium, which he is the exception. I guess we always have these exceptions, but that's kind of, it fits into this narrative.
Well, I guess if you're from a really isolated part of a country or a really rural area, you're really dependent upon talent ID and someone being there to identify you and see you. I think in Pochettino's book by Guillaume Balaguer, he talks about the fact that Bielsa, Pochettino lived in a very rural place like farmland, very talented player, and I think Bielsa was at a club, they were doing trials and he wasn't able to make it, but Bielsa had heard about his talent and went to his house and actually and spoke to him, and he was able to then progress and play for the club and go on. But if Bielsa wasn't prepared to go and see him, he would have perhaps not made it, and Toni Kroos would have been in the same boat. So if you're in one of those rural areas, you just need to have eyes on you. You need that luck or being in the right place at the right time to be seen. Now, if you're at the other end of the spectrum and you're a massively overpopulated and densely populated place, you've got the other problem in that who can filter all, it's like looking for a needle in a haystack to find talent, because there's so many players in front of you that potentially you could be looking at. So I guess if we look at a case study of PSG, so Paris is the largest population in Europe in terms of cities. So in 2012 it had just under 13 million, so it's huge, bigger than London. But PSG is generally, Paris is a one club city. PSG is the big club there. There's obviously lots of clubs underneath that, but it's not like in Manchester where you've got Man U and Man City vying for players. It's not like London where you've got Arsenal, Tottenham and Chelsea and so on and so forth. So PSG are there in this massive overpopulated, densely populated place. And when you look at the players that they weren't able to recruit or they overlooked, the list is staggering. Like, you've got Mahrez, Martial, Koeman, Kante, Evra, Pogba, Drogba, Henry, Trezeguet, all of which at some point in the development lived in Paris.
Can I have that on my FIFA team?
Yeah, what a team that would be. Very attacking, but all of those players lived either in the centre of Paris or in one of the urban areas or suburbs around Paris, and none of them were recruited by PSG. They all went to other clubs to further their development. And when you actually drill into the numbers, Paris is such a hotbed for talent. 25% of French professionals come from the suburbs of Paris alone. No, 1 in 4 players come from the suburbs of Paris. It's mad.
That's amazing.
But PSG, whether it's complacency, and we go back to that, the topic of that, or whether it's just not having, if you've got all that population to look at, it must be such a difficult task to have the recruitment structure to be able to identify these players. So it's inevitable that some are going to slip through the net.
Yeah, it's a case of, is it their fault, or remember they didn't start investing until later? How much does that money impact that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the investment has come in more recent years, and that's obviously changed the outlook of the club. So they've gone from, a relatively big French club to now being perhaps one of the super clubs that we talked about in a previous podcast, because of the money, the commercial rights, the endorsements, the players that they can now attract through the finances that they have. So obviously their recruitment is now probably more robust and can identify these players and take these players in, as opposed to losing them as they would have done in the past. So I guess money would be a big factor in all of this. I guess going back to Gary Lineker's statement about Germany being constantly winning, always having success, often at the expense of England, and it's almost being inevitable. I guess there comes with this some level of bias, so some sort of familiarity bias or confirmation bias. So if we're used to seeing things happening, then we subconsciously create these biases, and bias is absolutely fine, but it's understanding that we have these bias. So even the example that you used of Greece winning the Euros, and having more success in the European tournaments than England, their manager was German. So again, we're sort of creating this bias that can be unhealthy sometimes if we don't know it's there and we're not constantly checking it.
Totally agree with you on that one. the self-prophecy theory, brings in, holds really true in this case, where if you believe you're going to fail at something, you believe you're not as good, or you believe, when we bring it back to the coaching world, there's been studies done, when we deal with a high-skilled and a low-skilled player within our teams, we have a higher standard for the high-skilled players. So they rarely achieve the goal they're supposed to, because we want them to become better. But a low-skilled player, we pat them on the head, we say good job, we give them lots of praises without challenging them as much. And of course, the self-prophecy theory comes true, and I think that could be related to this bias that sometimes we think someone's better than us. We think, we're better than that group. And as you said, I think it's perfectly fine to make sure that we are aware of it. It is human. It is part of being, us. This we make these assumptions based off of previous experiences, but at least we need to know about them before we can hold off. So, thanks for joining the conversation. If any of this has sparked an interest in you, check out our resources in the description below to go and find out about the sources and links to learn more on your own. Here's how you can add to the discussion. First, you can agree or disagree on our position by commenting below. You can engage with others who have stated their stance. And finally, if you have a quote or a topic area that you'd like to suggest to us, please leave us with that information, because your opinion matters. May the myths be dispelled and the truth stick.